The hum of the jet bridge filled the air as passengers filed into the gleaming first-class cabin of Flight 742 to Los Angeles. Naomi adjusted her tote bag and stepped forward, ticket in hand. She had been looking forward to this trip for months, a chance to present her latest research at a national medical conference, something she'd worked her entire career for. Her heart was light as she approached the smiling flight attendant at the door. Heather Collins, read the polished name tag pinned neatly to the attendant's uniform. Heather greeted the man in front of Naomi, a silver-haired gentleman in a tailored suit, with a bright, practiced warmth. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Taylor. Seat 2A. We'll have champagne ready for you shortly." Then Naomi stepped up. Heather's expression shifted in an instant. The warmth vanished. Her smile flattened, her tone cooled. "Can I help you?" she asked, as if Naomi were standing in the wrong line. Naomi offered her boarding pass. "First class, 2C. Heather's eyes narrowed slightly. She took the ticket but didn't move to scan it. "Are you sure this isn't for business class, ma'am? First class begins here." She gestured to the seats behind her, the same section Naomi was already standing in. Naomi had seen this look before. The double take, the suspicion, the unspoken, "You don't belong here." Years of navigating hospital corridors, boardrooms, and conferences had trained her to recognize that subtle shift. A smile that falters the moment her skin color enters the equation. She kept her tone steady. "You might want to check your list." Heather's brows lifted in faint surprise at Naomi's calm confidence. With a tight smile, she scanned the boarding pass. The green light beeped. "Seat 2C, she repeated, her tone stiff. "Welcome aboard." But there was no welcome in her voice. Naomi walked to her seat, aware of the eyes following her. The businessman in 2A pretending not to stare, the couple across the aisle whispering. She placed her bag in the overhead compartment and settled in, her pulse steady, though her chest carried that familiar heaviness, the kind that comes from being constantly measured, constantly questioned. As passengers continued boarding, Heather's tone returned to its earlier brightness, but only for certain faces. Naomi noticed. Every smile, every warm greeting, every welcome aboard was reserved for passengers who didn't look like her. She took a slow breath, straightened her blazer, and opened the folder on her lap. Her presentation notes on new immunotherapy techniques. Her work spoke louder than any assumption ever could. Still, the sting lingered. She had paid nearly $3,000 for this seat. Yet somehow, she was still being treated like she'd wandered into the wrong place. A man in uniform passed by, the head purser. He greeted Heather briefly, scanning the cabin with a trained eye. Naomi caught the faintest flicker of recognition in his gaze, and then a nod of quiet respect. "Dr. Naomi Brooks, correct?" he said. "Pleasure to have you on board, ma'am. Congratulations on your keynote invitation." Heather froze. Naomi looked up, offering a small smile. "Thank you." The purser moved on, but Heather's face had lost a shade of color. She avoided eye contact, suddenly busier than ever, arranging champagne glasses. The moment should have ended there. But something about Heather's expression told Naomi it wouldn't. That cold look, the one that mixed disbelief with bruised pride, said this wasn't over. And it wasn't. Because an hour into the flight, as the seatbelt signs flickered off and the service began, Heather would do something that would change the course of Naomi's trip. And her life, in a way no one on that plane could have predicted. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful real-life stories like this. And tell us in the comments, which country are you watching from right now? I'd love to know where our community is tuning in from. Back to the story. As the engines roared and the plane lifted off, Naomi leaned back in her seat. The city lights shrank beneath the clouds. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself breathe. Unaware that the real turbulence on this flight wouldn't come from the skies above, but from the person standing just a few feet away, pouring champagne with a fake smile. And before the plane landed in Los Angeles, that smile would become the spark that set everything in motion. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane leveled above the clouds, and the familiar hum of flight filled the air. Naomi settled into her seat, scrolling through her notes for the presentation she would deliver the next day. Around her, conversation floated between passengers. Casual, light, the kind of chatter that filled first-class cabins on long flights. but a different tone hovered nearby. From 2 rows behind, a woman's voice whispered, "She must have switched seats when no one was looking." Another voice, a man's, replied softly, "They really need to check more carefully before takeoff." Naomi didn't turn around. She didn't need to. She had learned long ago that racism didn't always shout. Sometimes it simply murmured just loud enough to make sure you heard. Heather moved through the aisle with her practiced grace, offering menus and glasses of sparkling wine. "Champagne, Mr. Taylor?" She beamed at the man in 2A. "Thank you," he said, smiling back. She turned toward Naomi, saw her watching, and her tone cooled instantly. "Would you like something to drink?" The words were flat, stripped of warmth. "Yes, just water, please," Naomi said politely. Heather gave a curt nod and walked away. Minutes passed. The sound of clinking glasses filled the cabin as everyone else received their drinks. Heather poured wine for the couple across the aisle, bent down to chat about their honeymoon, then stopped to refill another passenger's glass. She laughed easily, the perfect hostess. But Naomi's tray table remained empty. She glanced toward the galley. Heather avoided her gaze completely, her expression unreadable. Naomi could feel the sting rising in her chest, but she kept her posture steady, her expression calm. Years of subtle exclusion had taught her the art of quiet resilience, of not giving them the reaction they wanted. She pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded above her seat. Heather looked up immediately, then looked away as if she hadn't heard it. The businessman beside her, the one in 2A, glanced over. Their eyes met briefly. His face tightened, guilt flickering behind his polite smile. He shifted in his seat, opened his laptop, and pretended not to notice. Naomi pressed the button again. This time, Heather sighed audibly and turned. "Yes? I just asked for water earlier," Naomi said evenly. "Could I please have it?" Heather's smile returned, but it was the kind of smile meant to disguise irritation. "Of course," she said. "We're quite busy, you know. I'll bring it when I can." Naomi didn't respond. She simply nodded, eyes steady. When the water finally came, Heather placed it down with a little too much force, enough for a few drops to spill onto Naomi's napkin. "There you go," she said, turning quickly to leave. Naomi dabbed the spill, quietly repeating to herself a line her mother had once told her. "Never let them define the room you've earned your place in." She looked around the cabin again. Everyone seemed at ease, sipping drinks, adjusting pillows, typing emails. Yet beneath the polished calm, she felt the weight of quiet judgment pressing against her like cabin pressure. Every stolen glance, every whispered assumption chipped away at something deeper than comfort. Still, she refused to shrink. She took out her phone, pulled up the medical presentation again, and started reviewing her slides. Her voice, when she rehearsed silently under her breath, was strong. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was preparing to speak on equal access to advanced treatments while being denied something as basic as respect. A flight attendant from the other aisle, younger, new, probably in training, approached Naomi's row a few minutes later. She looked confused when she noticed the untouched water glass and asked softly, "Dr. Brooks, would you like a meal preference noted?" Before Naomi could answer, Heather appeared beside her, tone sharp. "I've already handled this section, thank you." The trainee nodded quickly and moved on, clearly uncomfortable. Heather lingered just long enough to make her point, a silent warning that Naomi's comfort depended on her mercy. Then she smiled that same tight smile and walked away again. Naomi exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in resolve, because she could sense what Heather couldn't, that others were watching now. The businessman in 2A had stopped pretending. His hands were still on the keyboard, but he hadn't typed in minutes. His jaw was tense. The couple across the aisle had exchanged uneasy glances. Something in the air had shifted. Heather thought she was winning. She thought she had successfully put Naomi in her place. But the truth was, every small act of cruelty was being noticed. And soon, someone on that flight would decide they'd seen enough. The question wasn't if this would escalate. It was how far Heather was willing to go before the world saw who she really was. The scent of roasted almonds and fresh coffee drifted through the cabin as the flight attendants rolled out the drink cart again. Naomi had finally settled into a quiet rhythm, notes open, headphones in, heart rate back to normal. She refused to let the tension ruin the flight. But as Heather approached, That fragile peace began to fracture. Heather's movements were overly deliberate now, the kind of sharp, performative professionalism that carried an edge. Every gesture seemed designed to remind Naomi who controlled comfort in this space. Naomi closed her laptop gently and offered a polite nod as Heather neared her row. "May I have another glass of water, please?" Heather's smile was thin. "Of course," she said, voice bright enough for nearby passengers to hear. But the way she gripped the pitcher, one hand stiff, the other trembling with something that wasn't nerves, made Naomi's stomach tighten. Heather poured for the man in 2A first, chatting about the conference he was attending in San Francisco. Then she turned to Naomi. The movement was quick, too quick to be innocent. Cold water splashed across Naomi's lap, soaking her blouse and skirt. The sound was sharp enough to make heads turn. Ice cubes scattered across the tray table, some falling to the floor. Naomi froze, stunned by the shock of the cold. "Oh my!" Heather exclaimed loudly, hand to her chest. "You should watch where you put your legs, ma'am." A murmur rippled through the cabin. The businessman in 2A turned his head immediately, eyes narrowing. The couple across the aisle stared, mouths slightly open. Naomi blinked, feeling the sting not just of the cold but of humiliation. Her first instinct was disbelief, not at the spill itself, but at Heather's audacity to blame her. She drew a slow breath, straightened in her seat, and said in a voice calm enough to cut through the cabin noise, "I did. You just decided to walk through them." The silence that followed was instant, the kind that swallows every other sound. Even the hum of the engines seemed to fade. Heather's face flushed a deep red. For a second, her mask cracked, pride clashing with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to respond, then thought better of it. Without another word, she grabbed a few napkins and dropped them onto Naomi's tray like an afterthought. "There," she said curtly. "That should help." Naomi didn't move. She didn't need to. Her composure was her shield, and it was working. The businessman in 2A muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Not quietly enough. Several passengers heard it. A few nodded. Heather froze again, realizing the room had shifted. Naomi carefully lifted one of the napkins and began dabbing her skirt, movements precise, unhurried. She refused to play the role Heather wanted her to. The angry black woman, the disruptive passenger. She would not give her that satisfaction. Instead, she smiled faintly. "Thank you for your assistance," she said, tone even, eyes unflinching. Heather's jaw tightened. She forced a brittle smile, then turned sharply toward the galley. Her shoes clicked against the carpet, each step echoing her frustration. As soon as she was gone, whispers filled the cabin again, but the tone was different now. No longer skeptical, no longer judgmental. It carried sympathy, even outrage. "That wasn't an accident," one woman murmured to her husband. "Did you see how she blamed her?" another whispered. Naomi caught fragments, but pretended not to. She focused on cleaning herself up, using the linen napkin the businessman quietly handed her. "Here," he said softly. "You shouldn't have to use those flimsy things." She accepted it with a nod of gratitude. "Thank you." He hesitated, then leaned closer. "That was completely out of line. I saw what she did." Naomi's eyes met his. "I know," she said, "but I've learned something. You can't change who people are in a moment like this. You can only control how you respond." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. The exchange lasted just seconds, but it shifted something in the air, from silent observation to awareness. Meanwhile, Heather stood at the galley counter, face tight with resentment. She could feel the passengers' eyes on her. Every fake smile she'd offered earlier now felt like a performance no one was buying anymore. Her colleague, the trainee from before, whispered cautiously, "Heather, do you want me to handle that section for a bit?" Heather snapped, "No, I've got it." But the confidence she once had was gone. Every step back toward Naomi's row felt heavier, more forced. The authority she'd wielded so carelessly now felt fragile, because for the first time, people were watching. Naomi sat in quiet dignity, her damp skirt already beginning to dry, her gaze fixed calmly ahead. She wasn't planning revenge, not yet, but she understood the weight of this moment, and she knew the story wasn't over. The businessman leaned back, crossing his arms. "Unbelievable," he repeated under his breath, this time louder. Heather heard it. Everyone did. And that single word, from someone she thought was on her side, planted the seed of something far greater than she could control. A chain reaction that would soon make her wish that water spill had been her only mistake. The tension in the cabin had grown thick enough to taste. Even the faint hum of the engines couldn't drown it out. Heather's polished professionalism was beginning to crack, and every time she passed Naomi's seat, her movements carried a little more resentment, a little more venom disguised as duty. Naomi could feel it, though she pretended not to. Years of navigating subtle prejudice had made her fluent in the language of hostility wrapped in a smile. But this wasn't subtle anymore. Heather's whispers had become louder, her comments sharper. While collecting empty glasses, she chuckled to a passenger in the row behind Naomi. "Some people just don't belong here. You can always tell." The words were spoken as if Naomi couldn't hear. But she did, and so did the businessman beside her, whose jaw clenched tighter each time Heather opened her mouth. Naomi didn't respond. Not yet. She sat upright, eyes steady, her expression unreadable. Her restraint wasn't weakness, it was strategy. She knew exactly what kind of reaction Heather wanted, and she refused to hand it to her. Still, it hurt. Not because the insult was new, but because it was so familiar. The insinuation that no matter how hard she worked, no matter how far she rose, she'd always be seen as someone who didn't belong. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and Heather returned with meal trays. She smiled broadly at the white couple across the aisle, setting down their meals with exaggerated care. "Here you go, filet mignon and salmon, just as ordered." She reached Naomi's row and hesitated. Naomi had pre-ordered her meal days ago, a vegetarian entree to accommodate her dietary restrictions. She looked up politely. "Excuse me, I believe I had the vegetable risotto pre-ordered?" Heather's eyes flicked toward her, cold and dismissive. "We're out." Naomi frowned slightly. "That's strange. I pre-ordered it through the airline's app last week." Heather shrugged. "Well, maybe check next time. We only have what we have." The businessman shifted in his seat. "I'm pretty sure they serve pre-orders first," he said calmly, not raising his voice. Heather ignored him completely. "Would you like the chicken instead?" Naomi's tone stayed composed. "I don't eat meat. Could you please check if there's an alternative available?" Heather's lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I already told you, we're out. Some passengers always expect special treatment." The air in the cabin froze. Then came the line that shattered the thin veil of civility. "You people always expect special treatment." Gasps rippled through first class. Every head turned. The businessman's fork clattered onto his tray. Even the flight attendant trainee at the far end of the aisle stopped mid-step. Naomi blinked once, twice. The words hung in the air like smoke, filling the space with something heavier than sound. She didn't shout. She didn't flinch. Her voice, when it came, was low, calm enough to make the silence louder. "What exactly do you mean by you people, Miss Collins?" Heather froze. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Naomi's gaze was steady, unwavering. "I asked for the meal I pre-ordered, nothing more. You've ignored my requests, spilled water on me, and made repeated comments suggesting I don't belong here. And now you've chosen to make that bias public." Whispers filled the air again, this time not against Naomi, but for her. "She said you people, didn't she?" "She really just said that. This is unacceptable." Heather's composure began to crumble. "I didn't mean it like that," she stammered, her cheeks flushing red. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were surgical, calm, controlled, but cutting deep. "Intent does not erase impact. You've humiliated me repeatedly in front of this cabin, and now you've revealed exactly why." The businessman leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "She owes you an apology, Dr. Brooks." The use of Naomi's title hit the cabin like a spotlight. Heather's eyes widened. She hadn't realized Naomi was a doctor. The power dynamic she'd tried to exploit flipped instantly. Naomi gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but didn't look away. "I don't need an apology," she said softly. "I need respect." Heather's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before she turned and walked briskly toward the galley, muttering under her breath. The door closed behind her with a sharp click. The cabin remained silent for several seconds. Then the businessman exhaled, shaking his head. "That was unbelievable." Naomi sighed quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Unfortunately, it's not," she murmured. This isn't the first time, and it won't be the last, but at least now. She looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of the passengers who'd been whispering earlier, the ones who doubted her place. None of them could hold her gaze now. People are finally seeing it for what it is. The businessman nodded. They definitely are. At the front of the plane, the purser, the senior attendant, was already on his way back from the galley, a storm brewing behind his professional calm. And Heather? She stood inside the galley, gripping the counter so tightly her knuckles turned white. Humiliation had curdled into something darker, something dangerous. The flight wasn't over, and the moment she stepped out of that galley again, Naomi would discover just how far Heather was willing to go to prove her point. The cabin door to the galley swung open with a force that made heads turn. Heather emerged, her face flushed, her composure unraveling by the second. The once confident smile she wore like armor was gone, replaced by something brittle, anger straining beneath the weight of humiliation. Naomi didn't flinch as Heather approached. She sat calmly in her seat, her eyes steady, her posture regal. Around her, the first-class cabin had fallen into a tense silence. The businessman in 2A pretended to type on his laptop, but his fingers hovered over the keys. The couple across the aisle leaned slightly forward, uneasy. Even the child 2 rows back had stopped fidgeting, clutching a teddy bear with wide eyes. Heather stopped beside Naomi's seat, arms crossed tightly. "You think you can talk to me like that and get away with it?" she hissed under her breath, her voice trembling with rage. Naomi looked up, her tone even, her gaze unshaken. "You should lower your voice. There's no reason to make a bigger scene than you already have." That sentence, calm, precise, and laced with dignity, seemed to set Heather off like a match to dry paper. "You people think you can do whatever you want," she snapped, forgetting herself entirely. "Always playing the victim, always making everything about race. Heather." The purser's voice cut through the air from the front of the cabin, but he was too far away to stop what happened next. In a flash of uncontrolled fury, Heather's hand shot out. The sound of the slap cracked through the cabin like lightning, sharp, echoing, impossible to mistake. Gasps filled the air. A fork clattered to the floor. Someone in the back shouted, "Oh my God!" The child's small voice broke through the stunned silence. She hit her. Heather froze, her own hand hovering midair, the reality of what she'd just done dawning slowly. Too slowly. Her chest heaved, her face pale beneath the flush of shock. Naomi didn't move. She sat perfectly still, one hand on her lap, the other slowly reaching for the armrest. Her eyes never left Heather's. The sting on her cheek burned, but her expression remained unbroken, calm, deliberate, strong. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You've crossed the line." The words carried more power than any shout could have. They cut through the cabin, slicing cleanly through the tension. Even the engines seemed quieter, as if the whole plane were listening. Heather blinked, backing a step away, her mouth opening in disbelief. "It was an accident," she stammered. She provoked me." "No," said the businessman firmly, rising halfway from his seat. "We all saw it. You hit her." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. "She slapped her." "I can't believe this. This is outrageous." Heather's breathing quickened. She looked around wildly, realizing she was alone. Every eye in the cabin was on her, not with sympathy, but condemnation. Naomi exhaled slowly, then reached for her phone. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, no theatrics, no trembling hands, just purpose. She unlocked it, opened her messages, and typed a single word. "Now." Then she set the phone face down on her tray table. Heather watched her, confusion mixing with fear. What are you doing?" Naomi didn't answer. She simply met Heather's gaze again, unblinking, unafraid. The purser rushed forward, his expression thunderous. "Heather, step aside, right now." Heather's lips quivered. She's exaggerating. I didn't mean." "Step aside." His tone was final, authoritative. Heather took a step back, trembling, her hands shaking as she fumbled with her apron. "You don't understand," she muttered. "She's trying to get me fired. She wants to ruin me." The purser turned to Naomi. "Dr. Brooks, are you all right?" Naomi nodded once. "I'll live." Her cheek had reddened, but her eyes glowed with composure, a kind of unshakable strength that made every other person in that cabin sit up a little straighter. The businessman handed her a napkin. "You should report this immediately," he said quietly. Naomi gave a faint smile. Already handled. Heather's eyes darted to the phone on Naomi's tray. What do you mean, handled? Naomi tilted her head slightly, as if deciding whether to answer. Then, in the same soft tone she'd used before, she said, let's just say that message wasn't for a friend. The purser looked uneasy but professional. Heather, I'll be documenting this. For your sake, I suggest you remain in the galley until we land. But Enough, he said sharply. Heather's lips trembled. Her eyes darted to the passengers, the same people she'd smiled at earlier, now looking at her with disgust and disbelief. She opened her mouth to defend herself again, but the words died before they formed. She turned and stormed toward the galley, slamming the door behind her. Silence blanketed the cabin. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt, folded her napkin neatly, and turned to the window. Below, the clouds drifted in soft waves, undisturbed, indifferent. The businessman finally spoke. Whatever you texted, I hope it shakes the right trees. Naomi's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. It will, because that single word, now, had already reached someone who could change the course of what was about to happen. Someone powerful enough to make sure Heather's accident wouldn't be buried under polite excuses or company apologies. Heather thought she'd silenced her target with one impulsive slap. But she'd only awakened something far louder. A reckoning that was already in motion, 30,000 feet above the ground. The sound of the captain's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We're experiencing a brief delay. The cabin air felt heavier than the pressurized walls could contain. Naomi sat upright, hands folded neatly in her lap, her face a mask of composure. The water stain on her blouse had dried into a pale outline, a quiet echo of everything that had happened. But her stillness was not submission. It was control. Across the aisle, Heather stood frozen near the galley curtain. Her usually confident posture had faltered. Her shoulders trembled just slightly. The calm announcement from the cockpit had done nothing to ease her nerves. She could feel eyes boring into her. Not with admiration, but with condemnation. The businessman from earlier, the one who had remained silent too long, finally spoke up, his voice cutting through the cabin's uneasy quiet. You just hit a passenger, he said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. In front of all of us. A few passengers nodded subtly, others murmured in agreement. The power dynamic that once favored Heather was shifting right before everyone's eyes. Heather spun toward him, her lips parting in disbelief. Sir, you didn't see what happened, she stammered. She was being aggressive. I was defending myself. Naomi tilted her head slightly, meeting Heather's eyes with unflinching calm. Aggressive? She said softly. I asked for the meal I paid for. Heather's composure cracked. You were? She caught herself, realizing every word she uttered could make things worse. Her eyes darted toward the other flight attendants, but none of them moved to support her. One busied herself with the coffee pot, pretending not to notice. Another slipped quietly into the galley, avoiding eye contact altogether. Heather's voice wavered. I'll call the captain, she threatened weakly, though everyone knew she didn't have to. The captain already knew. Naomi had made sure of that the moment she pressed send. Naomi remained still, her phone lying face down on the tray table. The quiet hum of the engines underscored the tension. From somewhere in the back, a passenger whispered, Is she okay? Another muttered, I've never seen anything like this. Heather fumbled for authority, her tone desperate now. You all need to remain calm, she said, her voice trembling slightly. This isn't calm? A woman from row 2 interrupted. You hit her. We are calm. You're the one falling apart. That broke the thin illusion of control completely. Heather's cheeks flushed crimson. For the first time since the flight took off, she realized she had lost the room. Naomi didn't look at her again. She simply reached for a napkin and gently dabbed at the spot on her sleeve where water had once been. Her movements were deliberate, her silence louder than any accusation could ever be. The businessman leaned slightly toward her. Are you okay, ma'am? He asked, his voice carrying a mix of shame and sincerity. Naomi gave a small nod. I'm fine, she replied softly, but thank you for asking. That simple exchange, polite, composed, dignified, cut through Heather more than any shouted confrontation could have. The other passengers had witnessed everything. The narrative Heather tried to construct had collapsed. Moments later, the intercom crackled again. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's calm but measured voice, "we'll be returning to the gate momentarily for an internal review matter. Please remain seated until further notice." Heather's breath hitched. "Returning to the gate?" she whispered, panic flickering in her eyes. No, this can't." Naomi didn't flinch. She simply exhaled, slow and controlled, eyes steady on the horizon outside her window. The businessman glanced at her phone. "That message you sent," he began cautiously, "was that too?" Naomi's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Let's just say," she murmured, "I don't believe in silence when it costs your dignity." The cabin stayed quiet for the rest of the descent. Heather's posture crumbled inch by inch, the authority draining out of her like air from a punctured tire. The other attendants avoided her completely now, a silent acknowledgement of where this was headed. As the aircraft banked slightly, the skyline below came into view. The world looked calm, unaware of the storm brewing inside that cabin. But Naomi knew what was coming. This was no longer about a spilled drink or a slap. It was about the cost of dignity, and what happens when someone refuses to pay it quietly. The plane touched down. No applause followed. Only the sound of the engines winding down and the quiet weight of reckoning filling the air. The cabin door opened with a sudden hiss, breaking the tense quiet that had settled over the aircraft. Two uniformed airport security officials stepped aboard, their presence commanding immediate attention. The murmurs in first class died down to an uneasy silence. Heather froze mid-step near the galley, her face stiffening. "Oh, thank God you're here," she began, her voice trembling but eager. "This passenger, she's been aggressive and disruptive. I had to defend myself when One of the officers raised his hand calmly. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "please take your seat." Heather blinked. "My seat? I'm the flight attendant." "She's the one." The officer's tone hardened. "We're here for the flight attendant." The words landed like a shockwave. Heads turned. A collective murmur rippled through the cabin. Naomi sat motionless, her hands folded, expression unreadable. Her stillness was a mirror of quiet power, the kind that doesn't need to shout to be heard. Heather's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. "There must be some mistake," she said weakly. "You don't understand." But before she could finish, the captain emerged from the cockpit, his usually confident stride faltering. His face was pale, beads of sweat glistening near his hairline. "Officers," he said, voice tight, "what's going on here?" The taller officer handed him a folded paper. "Captain, we were instructed to escort this flight attendant off the aircraft immediately for misconduct during service. Orders came directly from your operations center." Heather's jaw dropped. "Misconduct? You can't be serious. I was doing my job." The captain didn't respond. His eyes darted toward Naomi, then back to the officer, a dawning realization settling over his expression. He swallowed hard. I just received a call," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "From the CEO." That name, the CEO, made several passengers exchange glances. The air thickened. Heather's voice cracked. "The CEO? Why would he?" The captain turned toward her, his tone shifting to one of formal detachment. "Because Mrs. Blake," he said carefully, nodding toward Naomi, "is his wife." A stunned silence fell over the cabin. It was the kind of silence that demanded acknowledgement, heavy, undeniable, final. Heather staggered back a step, eyes wide. His wife?" she whispered. "You mean she's—" Naomi lifted her chin slightly, meeting Heather's gaze with composed restraint. "That's right," she said softly. "Naomi Blake." It was the first time she had spoken since the slap. Her voice carried no anger, only quiet authority. The businessman who had defended her earlier leaned back in his seat, whispering under his breath, "Oh my God." Heather's mind raced. Everything she'd said, every microaggression, every smirk and condescending tone, now replayed in brutal clarity. The passenger she had humiliated wasn't just any woman. She was married to Richard Blake, the airline's CEO, the man whose signature appeared on Heather's employee handbook. The captain cleared his throat. "Mrs. Blake," he said respectfully, "on behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely—" Naomi held up a hand, cutting him off gently. "Not now, Captain," she said. "Let's get through this safely." The officers stepped forward. "Ma'am," one said to Heather, "we'll need you to come with us." Heather's eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone, to defend her. But the passengers, The same ones she'd once served drinks to with forced smiles now stared at her with visible disgust. Even the child from earlier whispered softly to his mother, "That's the lady who hit her." Heather's legs wobbled as she gathered what was left of her dignity and followed the officers down the aisle. As she passed Naomi, their eyes met one last time. Heather opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to beg, but Naomi looked away. No words were needed. As the cabin door closed behind the officers, a heavy exhale rippled through the room. The businessman finally broke the silence. "I've flown this airline for 15 years, he said, shaking his head, "and I've never seen justice move that fast." Naomi gave a faint, knowing smile, turning to gaze out the window. "That's because it usually doesn't," she murmured. "But today someone made sure it did." The captain hesitated, then returned to the cockpit. Moments later, his voice came over the intercom, steady and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We'll resume our journey shortly." As the engines roared back to life, Naomi leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The storm had passed, at least for now. But somewhere deep down, she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger reckoning. The hum of the engines returned as the aircraft taxied slowly away from the gate. A heavy quiet still hung in the cabin, broken only by the faint click of seatbelts and the nervous rustle of passengers exchanging glances. The moment had changed everything, and everyone knew it. Naomi sat still, hands folded neatly in her lap, her composure unshaken. She wasn't one to revel in another person's downfall, even when it was deserved. But she also understood that silence, at times, could speak louder than confrontation. The captain reappeared, stepping into the first-class cabin. His voice, this time, carried no trace of formality, only humility. "Mrs. Blake," he began, lowering his cap respectfully, "I owe you a personal apology. What happened here should never have occurred. Not on this airline, not anywhere." Naomi looked up at him, her gaze soft but steady. "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly. "What matters now is that everyone here saw what dignity looks like, even when it's tested." A few passengers nodded, others murmured agreement. The businessman in 2A, who had watched the entire ordeal unfold, exhaled heavily and said, "Ma'am, I've seen a lot in my years of flying, but the way you handled that, you made a statement without saying a word." Naomi gave a faint smile. "Sometimes the loudest stand you can take," she replied, "is refusing to lower yourself to the level that expects your silence." Across the cabin, the two security officers stood beside Heather, who was now trembling visibly. The strength she had projected just an hour ago, that smug, brittle confidence, had vanished completely. Her face was pale, eyes red from humiliation and fear. She turned toward Naomi, her voice cracking. You're married to Mr. Blake, the CEO?" Naomi's expression didn't change. She looked directly at her, her tone calm but edged with quiet truth. "You didn't need to know who I'm married to," she said evenly, "to know how to treat me." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the cabin. Passengers shifted, whispering to one another. Some held their phones discreetly, recording the moment as Heather's expression crumpled under the weight of what she'd done. One of the officers gently touched Heather's arm. "Ma'am, it's time." Heather hesitated, her eyes darting desperately around the cabin, searching for empathy that wasn't there. The businessman looked away. The couple in 3A whispered. She brought this on herself. Even the child who had spoken earlier leaned closer to his mother and whispered softly, "She was mean, Mom." The cabin door opened with a metallic click. Cameras followed her every step as Heather was escorted out, shoulders hunched, head lowered. For the first time, Naomi looked away from her. Not out of disdain, but out of grace. Some battles didn't need a final word. They needed quiet closure. When the door sealed shut again, the tension in the air broke like a snapped thread. Passengers exhaled audibly. A few began clapping softly, hesitant at first, then stronger, more assured. Not in mockery, but in respect. Naomi didn't respond to the applause. She simply nodded once and turned toward the window, the city lights now fading in the distance. The captain lingered for a moment longer. "Mrs. Blake," he said, his tone heavy with remorse, "I'll make sure this never happens again." Naomi looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "Make sure it doesn't happen to anyone," she replied. "That's the real apology." Her words hung in the air like a quiet verdict. As the captain returned to the cockpit, The businessman leaned slightly toward her. "If I may, Mrs. Blake," he said, "your husband must be a lucky man." Naomi chuckled softly, shaking her head. "No," she said with gentle humor. "He's just a man who believes in accountability, same as I do." The engines roared louder, signaling takeoff clearance. Through the window, the tarmac lights blurred as the plane lifted into the night sky, a symbolic ascent from everything that had just transpired below. Behind her, a passenger whispered to another, "That woman just changed how people will see this airline." And they weren't wrong, because in a single flight, Naomi had done what entire diversity programs struggled to achieve. She'd forced people to confront their prejudice, not through anger, but through grace under fire. The plane steadied, cutting through the clouds, and Naomi allowed herself a slow exhale. Justice had found its voice. By sunrise the next morning, Naomi's name was everywhere. The story that began 30,000 feet in the air had already landed on every major news network. Headlines blared across screens. Flight attendant fired after assaulting airline owner's wife on first-class flight. CEO's wife humiliated mid-air. Racism in the sky? Clips recorded by passengers had gone viral overnight. The moment Heather slapped Naomi, followed by Naomi's calm, devastating response, had been replayed millions of times. Every frame told a story of power, prejudice, and poise. At the Blake family's residence, Naomi sat in her study, scrolling through a flood of messages. Some were apologies from strangers who had witnessed the footage. Others were defensive, dismissive, and cruel, people still trying to justify what Heather had done. Richard, her husband, entered quietly, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I've already spoken with PR," he said to someone on the line. "No, this isn't just about damage control, it's about accountability." When he hung up, he turned to her. "They want you to make a statement, Naomi. It's everywhere, everyone's watching." She nodded, eyes still fixed on the screen. "Then they'll get one, but not the one they expect." Within the hour, Naomi sat before a small camera crew in her home office. There was no makeup artist, no rehearsed script, just truth. She adjusted the microphone, took a breath, and looked straight into the lens. "I've spent my life in rooms where I was underestimated before I even spoke," she began, her tone calm but cutting through every syllable. "What happened on that flight wasn't just about a rude attendant or an isolated act of violence. It was about how deeply prejudice still runs, even in places that claim to be fair, professional, and inclusive." Her gaze didn't waver. "I don't need an apology. I don't want sympathy. What I want is change, and that starts now." She paused, then continued. "Effective immediately, I am calling for mandatory anti-bias and cultural awareness training across all staff within our airline, from flight attendants to management. No employee should carry the kind of ignorance that humiliates others in the name of service." Her voice softened, but her conviction didn't. Kindness shouldn't depend on someone's skin color or social status. Respect isn't earned by title, it's owed by humanity. The video lasted less than 3 minutes, but by the time it ended, it had already begun to move across the internet like wildfire. Hashtags like Naomi Blake, Dignity in the Sky, and Do Better Airlines trended across social media. Celebrities reposted her speech. Activists applauded her composure. Even major corporate leaders weighed in, calling her response a masterclass in grace under pressure. Not everyone agreed. A small but loud portion of the internet accused her of using her privilege as the CEO's wife to get justice others couldn't. Naomi didn't respond. She didn't have to. The truth was visible for anyone willing to see it. At the airline headquarters, Richard Blake held an emergency press conference. His statement was brief. "As CEO, I take full responsibility for ensuring our company represents fairness and respect in every cabin, every airport, every customer interaction. What happened on Flight 742 is unacceptable, not because of who my wife is, but because of what she represents. Every passenger deserves dignity." Reporters filled the room with flashes and questions, but his message was clear. This was more than a scandal. It was a turning point. Meanwhile, Heather Collins, now suspended and under investigation, released her own statement through her lawyer. Her voice trembled in the recorded apology. "I want to sincerely apologize to Mrs. Blake for my actions. My behavior was inexcusable. I reacted out of ignorance, not hate, but ignorance is no excuse. I will live with this regret for the rest of my life." Her letter was emotional, raw, and filled with remorse. Yet when Richard's assistant called to ask if Naomi would consider a private meeting with Heather, Naomi's answer was immediate. "No," she said gently, setting her phone aside. When Richard looked at her questioningly, Naomi explained, "Forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means peace." She stood by the window, watching the early morning sunlight touch the city below. The world had moved fast, faster than she expected. But deep down, she knew her message had reached far beyond the walls of her home or her husband's office. That flight wasn't just a personal insult. It had become a lesson in accountability, a mirror held up to a society still learning what equality truly meant. Naomi smiled faintly. "Let them keep talking," she murmured, because this time, the conversation might finally change something. And as her phone lit up with yet another headline, "Airline implements mandatory anti-bias training following Naomi Blake's statement," she exhaled slowly. Her voice had done what anger alone never could. It had shifted the ground beneath an entire industry. The city stretched wide beneath Naomi's office window, glass towers catching the afternoon sun, clouds drifting lazily above. From this height, the world looked quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded days earlier, 30,000 feet in the air. Naomi leaned back in her chair, her reflection faintly visible against the window pane. The news cycle had begun to move on, as it always did. But the impact of that one flight still rippled through the industry, changing conversations in boardrooms, training halls, and crew lounges across the country. She wasn't proud of what had happened. No decent person would be. But she was proud of what came from it, because that moment of humiliation had turned into a moment of reckoning, not just for one flight attendant, but for a system that too often allowed subtle cruelty to pass as professionalism. As she sipped her tea, her mother's voice echoed in memory. A voice she hadn't heard in years, but one she carried like scripture. "People will test your worth," her mother used to say, "until they realize they can't define it." Naomi smiled faintly. That single sentence had guided her through medical school, through board meetings where she was the only black woman in the room, and now, through a story that had made the world stop and look at itself. She turned slightly, glancing at a framed photo on her desk, her mother standing beside her in her graduation gown, both of them smiling through tears. "You were right again, Mom," Naomi whispered softly. "They tried, but they didn't get to decide." Her phone buzzed. A new email notification from corporate HR. Update: first round of anti-bias training completed across all flight crews. Feedback overwhelmingly positive. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet satisfaction settle in. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about revenge. It was about awareness, about the small steps that led to real change. Naomi wasn't naive. She knew one incident wouldn't erase the years of discrimination people faced daily. But it was a start, a reminder that dignity doesn't need a title, and respect doesn't require influence. She thought of Heather again, not with anger, but with clarity. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant releasing the weight of what no longer deserved space in her heart. That slap had been meant to humiliate her. Instead, it revealed everything wrong with a culture that normalized disrespect. It showed that power, when used with grace, could expose what pride tried to hide. Naomi walked toward the window and watched a jet streak across the sky, its contrail glimmering against the sunlight. Somewhere in that distance, passengers were boarding planes, greeted by attendants who, hopefully, now saw service through a different lens. She placed a hand gently against the glass and whispered to herself. The flight didn't just change altitude that day. It changed perspective. For a moment, the world outside seemed to pause, as though agreeing with her. Then she turned back to her desk, opened her laptop, and began typing her next initiative, a foundation focused on empathy and equal opportunity in corporate spaces. She wanted to make sure the lessons from that flight wouldn't fade when the headlines did. Because for Naomi, power was never about dominance. It was about using position to create possibility. And grace, real grace, meant standing firm without ever losing your humanity. If you watched this far, thank you. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? What lesson did Naomi's story leave with you today? Do you think Heather deserved forgiveness, or was accountability enough? Would you have stayed calm if you were in Naomi's place? And most importantly, do you believe change like this can last? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because stories like this aren't just meant to be watched. They're meant to be felt, discussed, and remembered.